G'day and welcome to this DFA live stream event. Great to have you on board. We're in pre-show mode at the moment, and we'll just run that for a couple of moments so that we allow a few more seconds and minutes for people to come on board. As always, you know, people never on time. Well, actually, 278 are, so well done to you. Congratulations. Great to see so many new names on as well. It's tremendous to see all the old names, you know, old in terms of history, not necessarily age, but also lots of new people on, and that's great. It shows that the word is getting out. And I keep saying to people, please spread the word about DFA and what we do here, because I think this is a really critical time for property. And in fact, we're going to have a really interesting conversation this evening. Veronica's online. She'll be on in a moment or two. And she kept me waiting just a moment before. So anyway, phew, it's all good. So we'll just run this for another one moment. And we're running with our chat system on again tonight. We broke it the other day. We had too many comments. So we'll have to see how long it holds up to tonight as well. But all part of the technology exploration that we're going through at the moment as well. And great to see so many new names too. Hi to you all. And Ben and Anthony and a few others, Amelia. Great to see you all on there. And Plexus, thank you very much for doing the moderating again. It's really great to have somebody on the stream just to keep it all in control. And yep, as somebody asked, I did compose all the music as well. That's another of my interests. So when I've got nothing better to do, I'm a composer. All right, well, I think we're there. So I'm now going to cut across and run the intro. And then when we come back, we'll get Veronica on and we'll get started. So stand by. Well, hello there. Good evening. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to tonight's live stream. It's the 14th of July 2020. Great to have you on board. And we're in for a real treat this evening with a property bull, property bear, property what? Realist, we hope. We'll see in just a moment or two. And just before that, I always have to just make this point. This isn't financial advice. Please do play nice in the chat room. It's being moderated, no racial slurs. This is as at the 30th of June. I forgot to change the date. Ignore that. It's actually the 14th of July. And use that Walk the World to get my attention if you want to get on the chat. And Super Chat's enabled if you want to make a contribution, or indeed if you want to make sure that your question or comment is picked up. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to push a couple of buttons. The first one I'm going to push is that one. And then the second one is that one. Veronica, are you there?
I am. Hello. How you doing?
Yeah, very good. Thank you so much for sparing some time with us. Your message said 2.5 hours. That could be a long time.
What the hell?
Hopefully, it won't go quite that long. But you know, there's a lot of people with a lot of questions. So let's get going. And look, I think a really good place to start, Veronica, will be just for people to understand a little bit about you. You're a property buyer, you're an author, you're involved in property-related TV and all sorts of exciting things, and you've got a really, you know, insightful perspective on property. So just, what's a property buyer? That's a good place to start, I think.
Okay, well, a buyer's agent is a licensed real estate agent that actually acts for the buyer, not the seller. So we're meant to level the playing field. That's the real purpose of our reason for our living. And so, you know, you'll find buyer's agents that help owner-occupiers, you'll find buyer's agents that help investors, and people like me will help both. But I do tend to come at it from the owner-occupier's perspective. I'm also an author. I've got a book called Auction Ready. I should show you the cover of it. How to buy a property at auction even though you're scared shitless. I've co-founded Home Buyer Academy, which is an online, we're actually in the final stages of launching this, actually, an online support mentoring course for first home buyers. I'm co-host of the podcast, The Elephant in the Room. I think fundamentally what I am, though, I am a property realist. I've been accused of being a bull. I've been accused of being a bull. Actually, I've been accused of being a bear too by a bull. But at the end of the day, I'm one of those rare birds in property that will actually say to a lot of people, don't buy property.
Yeah, and the point we keep making, because you and I probably started from different perspectives, but we seem to be coming closer and closer together, right?
All your prophecies are coming true, I think, Martin.
Well, it could well be. In fact, there's a really good place to start. I think the conversation here. Let me just put this one up. This is from. I don't know if that works. Yeah, there. So, how's that? That's pretty posh, isn't it? So, Jeff said, "What's your opinion of fear of missing out conditioning of the whole country? 20 years of fear of missing out and propaganda. Is this still effective today, or has the majority awoken?" Discuss.
Oh, I hope the majority have woken, but I bet they haven't. I think what was interesting, we saw that, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, we saw at the end of, or just after the auction last year, that the markets took off again, and we'd had 2 years of downturn, and yet FOMO didn't take long until it kicked right back in there and sent prices soaring again. So I suspect that FOMO is still simmering under the surface in a lot of places, particularly where affordability is an issue. But if you're in Perth, perhaps, or Darwin, you might not be feeling FOMO at all.
And that's part of the problem, isn't it? Because one of the things that we quite often say, and I think it's true, is you can't talk about the property market as a wodge, right? In fact, there are multiple markets within markets within markets, and you can split them by geography, property type, property value range, and in fact, a lot of the rubbish that's written in the mainstream media just ignores all that and just sort of chucks out everything's going up 10%, or first-time buyers are missing out, you've got to buy. And actually, the real issue is, of course, it's way, way, way more complicated than that.
That's exactly right. I think the thing I found too when I first started filming, I didn't even mention in my little intro that I've co-hosted a show on Lifestyle Channel called Location Australia, and that was actually quite insightful for me, coming just from Sydney, to actually the different types of properties, the different market dynamics, the different speeds of different markets across the country. It's fascinating, really, and that for me has helped form a lot of my opinions and my approach to property since doing those shows.
Yeah, and that is, I think, a very important point, that once you start talking to people about what's driving them to buy property, one of the things you come to quite quickly is this isn't just a rational economic decision, is it? There's a bunch of psychology and a bunch of herd mentality, I would say lemmings sometimes, that are also driving behaviour.
People are sheep. It's like, you're all individuals. I'm not. So particularly when it comes, it's one of the reasons we started the podcast. So the elephant in the room, the elephant is the metaphor for the subconscious mind. And, psychologists will say that upwards of 80%, some say as high as 95% of our decisions are actually made through our subconscious. The elephant is the metaphor for our subconscious. The rider, the puny little figure on top, is meant to be our rational mind. And so you think about it, the elephant wants to turn left and the rider wants to turn right. Which do you think is going to dominate? Well, typically it's the elephant. And with property, oh my God, I hear it all the time, just crazy rationalization of behavior. And yet it's mostly emotional, even with investors.
And of course, the old adage that quite often we find is that even now people say property can only ever go up, right? And
Yes.
in my surveys, it amazes me how often...
I shouldn't laugh.
Every 7 years property prices double, right? Yeah. Nearly half the people that I survey still believe that.
Is that because have the people that you've surveyed been sucked in by property spruikers and actually bought something off the plan at some point?
Some of it's off the plan. Some of it's property investors who bought a long time ago. And of course, the point is we've had an abnormal 20 or 30 years in the market, haven't we? If you think of what's happened with interest rates coming down, credit much more available,
yes,
investors booming and all those things. But I think people, if they stand back a bit further, will recognise that it just doesn't have to be like that. It's not often like that. In fact, this was an anomaly.
Well, it's also an anomaly because of the type of stock and the volume of stock that's being built. So, and that's all, as you know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, that, we've got an economy that's basically largely built on construction of new property. And so that's all got to sort of, keep feeding the beast, so to speak. But, I just today read the March quarter pain and gain report that CoreLogic put out every quarter. And I love it. It's one of my favorite reports because it's a constant reminder that not all property goes up, and that indeed, on average, 12.3% properties that sold in Australia in the March quarter sold at a loss. So even in the boom, that number sits upwards of 9% of everything that's sold in this country during a boom. And I know that it doesn't boom everywhere, sells at a loss. Even in Sydney and Melbourne during the boom, some properties sell at a loss. So, this is a constant thing.
And, it amazes me. I often say that to people. People sometimes lose money. And, of course, those are gross numbers, right? You've also got stamp duty, other fees, other costs. When you add those all up, do the math. And by the way, a lot of property investors, if they were to do the math on the total return on property investment, more than half are actually underwater on a cash flow basis, right? Before you think of whether there's going to be capital gain or not. So there's something weird about this whole property thing.
Well, here's the thing, and I don't mind that, right? I don't mind being underwater on a cash flow basis as long as you've got a finite period or a short period of time that you anticipate that's going to be the case, and you are actually buying the sort of asset that is got a high probability of going up in value. So there are certain properties in certain locations that I can be very confident. I can't tell you what they're going to go up. Anyone who actually, these property planners, I tell you, that actually give these projections out with, nice, neat little annual growth rates. I mean, they just do my head in. I can't guarantee ever anything that's going to go up, but I can say if the market moves, that will do better than everything else in the market. I can tell you that. And so, for people that buy those sorts of properties and they have the cash flow available, so that's budgeted in and factored in at the outset, then there's nothing wrong with that. But the problem is people are told they need to actually buy a property to save tax. The wrong reason. And it's insane when you think about it. You might get back 47 cents in the dollar. Well, for every dollar you lose, you get 47 cents back, best case. It's nuts.
I have to say, a lot of people go to their tax advisor and they talk about negative gearing and all those good things. And it suddenly sounds like the government's giving you free money. It's not quite like that, right?
Oh, that's another one of my bugbears about government giving free money. Poor old first home buyers, right? The first home buyers who think that the grants are for them. They are not for them. The grants are for the construction industry, for the economy, for everybody else, not the actual first home buyer. So often, so many first home buyers, they focus on that grant, trying to qualify for every grant, and they absolutely don't focus on what they're buying instead, which can actually just send them down the river in financially if they're not careful. So, yeah, it's free money. They feel that they have to take advantage of and grab hold of it, but it's dangerous.
And particularly if you go for the 95% government guarantee scheme, and then, of course, prices drop 10%.
Well, and look, there's a case to be made for some people to go for that scheme, and in some areas. And so, but it really does come down to somebody who's really got an amazing income, and for whatever reason hasn't saved a deposit. But beyond that, and can afford to buy and can service at quite a high loan and buy a really quality asset in a good location, there's a case that could be put forward for that. But it's unfortunately not necessarily often used in those areas.
No, absolutely right. Well, just a few of the comments that we've had. Number of people have said they love your podcast and love your book, so that's excellent.
Oh, great.
I'll just put this one up if I can. There you go. See whether it comes up. Whoops. Try doing that. No.
No, it's technology.
See, it's got two. It's got too many messages. So it'll probably come back. There you go.
Oh, thank you, Maria.
Excellent to see.
I love this feature. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it sort of works some of the time. Now, here's an interesting and quite a serious one from Jenny, which basically said, lockdown till Christmas. Where will property prices go?
Oh, poor old Victoria. Well, okay, here's an interesting thing. there's lots of things that are going to feed into what happens to property prices. And if I sit here and tell you what's going to happen, I'm no better than those forecasters that I rubbish. So therefore, I can't tell you that. And I've even rubbished you, Martin, haven't I? The thing is, though, okay, we got a interesting thing. I saw a graph today, CoreLogic graph, which showed listings numbers. And of course, listings are, they've dived in April, sort of beginning of April when things really shut down. They dived and they sort of started recovering. They're sort of on the trajectory back up again. The thing is, though, it's not just listings, it's transactions. And I've just been doing a little bit of exercise just in Sydney. So this is quite limited in the application, but just looking in sort of about 7 suburbs at one, I looked at houses in Willoughby, I looked at apartments in Surrey Hills, I looked at Darlinghurst, Balmain, Leichhardt, where else to look? Darling Point. The transaction numbers are actually higher now than they were a year ago. And despite there's all this publicity around listings falling, right? So this is sort of interesting because that means that stuff's not being advertised, being sold off market. But the median is a really dangerous measure for property prices. The median in some of these areas is sat flat for the last 12 months. Some areas it's peaked. Some areas it's actually grown since February. So it's sort of interesting. So I guess the reason I'm talking about that is because a lot of people are saying that prices are only holding up because listings are down. But I'm sort of challenging, and certainly in my neck of the woods, whether listings really are down or not, and whether transactions really are down or not. They're not. And prices haven't really been falling. So that's only one little segment of the country. I tell you what, we've got some real problems. And I should say that if listings will dry up, if we have full-on restrictions again. So what's happening in Melbourne, I would imagine listings are really going to dry up, and that will, I guess, protect prices to a degree. But you've another one of I don't know if you've spoken to Kent Lardner ever before, Martin, but he's a property data guy. We've actually just started doing some monthly reports with him on the Elephant podcast. He's got a website called Suburb Trends. He's come up with sort of a method of identifying cooling spots or cold spots. And he's using the methodology of inventory levels. So that's not just listings, that's transactions, and then looking at how much stock is on the market. And also a vacancy rate where he looks at rentals that are more than 21 days old and how many are out there. And so, we just launched an episode last week on this, and we talked about areas and property types, and they all point to new, big new subdivisions, house and land packages, and oversupply of apartments. So basically, that seems to be the common theme pretty much with every single cold spot that we discussed. So that's the bottom of his list in terms of high levels of inventory and long vacancies for rentals, which means you can't sell it, you can't rent it. That's a pretty horrible place to be. So if you're looking at those sorts of areas, that sort of stock where there's no scarcity, where there's a lot on the market already, and also where there's a lot nearing completion or has just been completed, then that's going to be under a lot of pressure, those areas.
Well, just taking that conversation further, Edwin Almeida has asked a question. Which areas of Sydney will survive the downturn and tick upwards?
Well, I'm always going to say the inner 10K radius of the CBD of Sydney is the safest area in which to buy property. But that doesn't mean that every property in those areas is the safest type of property to buy. And so you've got there's areas within those 10K radius that has this oversupply issue when it comes to apartments, and potential ongoing supply because there's a conversion of industrial sites. So the apartment side of things, it could be problematic in certain areas. So therefore, in apartments, you need to be looking for scarcity. And, you can't go past an Art Deco apartment, for instance. You cannot replicate those, or even a really good warehouse apartment. Okay. Houses, very different. Houses in those areas, well, let's face it, land is scarce. There's no new housing subdivisions. And in fact, the more, old houses that are knocked down and converted into apartments, there's even less of them. So, And in some suburbs, you've got a heritage style or a period style of property that is a diminishing resource because they are getting demolished. So, those are the sorts of properties that you'd be looking at. You'd be looking at family homes. There's always families that want to live in these inner areas, and there's always a lack of stock for that property. It doesn't matter what the market's doing. Good families can't find good family homes, or can't find enough of them, and they will fight over them. So at the moment, that's what we're seeing as being pretty much one of the strongest segments of the market, and I would suggest that that's probably one of the safest areas at the moment.
Yeah, and my data is also showing something similar insofar that if you look over in the West, and if you look in units over in the West, they are really taking a bath. We're seeing so many examples of prices down, still on the market, significant falls from where they were last sold. And in fact, we're assembling, we've got 60 or 70 examples, thanks to Cookie Boy, one of the followers, to show just what's going on. In other places, and I think, houses closer in, and particularly on larger blocks and particularly attractive locations, less of a slide and probably always an undersupply. And I think that's probably sort of the dynamic that I'm seeing. But I really am worried about all of these land packages that are sort of being thrown out, thanks to home builder and everything else, right? I think people are really going to catch a cold here because, as we said earlier on, there's a lot of incentive from government, but it's all directed at the construction sector rather than actually necessarily making good transactions. And of course, the banks are very keen to lend because they want to write business because that's all they've got in terms of trying to drive profitability. So the pincer movement on prospective buyers into some of those areas, I think, is really troubling. And unfortunately, I think there people are really going to catch a cold.
And that's one of our big messages in Home Buyer Academy. And it's one of the reasons why we're launching your first home buyer guide is because it actually breaks my heart to think that first home buyers can save and save and save, and then in all good faith, think the government's helping them, and then find themselves with an asset that doesn't go up in value or might go backwards, and then and then there's another subdivision going up that basically means that any buyers coming into the area goes after that, doesn't go after your place, because they're basically falling for all the same traps you fell for. So it's a pretty horrible situation. And should something bad happen, or you get divorced, God forbid, or even you just get interstate transfer, not that there's many of those happening at the moment, I'd imagine, but if there's a change of life and you need to sell that property, you are stuck, and that's just a horrible, horrible, horrible place to be.
Very hard to get out, isn't it? And what I find in my mortgage stress stuff is that people get trapped into these situations and then basically say, well, I've got to go on trying to pay the mortgage, and I get more and more ground down by the pressure of trying to pay that mortgage, particularly if the unemployment situation changes and incomes get compressed. And that builds not just a financial issue around the property, but a broader financial issue for those individuals and those households. And ultimately, it can lead to terrible outcomes. But it's something which is a slow traffic accident. It takes several years. And so quite often people say, well, things haven't gone wrong yet. Yeah, but watch this space. Remember, it took Mandra 5 or 6 years to go from high levels of mortgage stress to what we're seeing there today over in the West, where we've got druggies on the streets, 38% falls in property prices, and people stuck in negative equity and property investors just unable to sell. So that's the worst scenario.
Well, actually, it's interesting because when I was reading through the Pain and Gain report today and just looking at Darwin units, right, in the March 20 quarter, 68.6% of units in Darwin were sold at a loss. So that's getting close to 3/4. Well, that's 2/3, right? A bit over 2/3. And that is actually climbing, that figure. And so that suggests to me that those people have just got sick of waiting. They got sick of waiting for things to get better. They're finally, realising they've got to get out. And so in Perth, is it Perth? I think that, hang on. I think I've written all these notes for myself. I've written somewhere that, I've got my notes wrong. But there were something like regional WA, 53.8% of investors lost money in the March quarter. they're not investing. I think that's what they've got to understand. If more than half of them lose money in one quarter, but the Gold Coast units, 42.2% of Gold Coast units. A lot of spookers been selling Gold Coast units. And I think it's there that values are 31% less than they were 7 years ago. Or it might be Darwin. At the end of the day, it's a bloodbath, and it has been for a while. It's just that people haven't actually been selling.
No, that's right. Well, people will hold on for a certain period of time because they sort of hope that things will recover. And of course, people learnt in the early 2000s because we had some pressures around up towards the global financial crisis and then beyond. But then incomes were growing much faster. So people could grow into the property and grow into the mortgage, right? But there's been no real increase in incomes for most people in the last 10 years. And now, of course, we've got the global financial crisis echoing down, plus, of course, COVID and everything else. So the assumption has got to be that incomes are going nowhere for the next 5 years. And if that's the case, then if you are trapped in a property with really nowhere to go, better to get out quicker rather than slower, in my unprofessional view, at least.
Well, I mean, this is something that certainly when ASIC sort of started putting the squeeze on investment funds, and then, of course, the bank started really looking at, or the Royal Commission came in and all the rest of it, and it became very difficult for people to get funds to actually buy their homes or upgrade their homes or renovate their homes. It was really interesting the amount of people that came to me initially wanting to upgrade their home, but then went back to their mortgage broker and found that, actually, I can't borrow the amount of money that I could borrow before. Obviously, all the various metrics and limits came down. But often it was because they had an investment property. It was basically turned into an anchor. It was dragging them behind and really slowing them down. And so we have these conversations. Well, what's the caliber of that asset? Is it ever going to recover? What's the opportunity cost of holding that? You don't, because of course, human beings, we don't like to feel loss. It's called loss aversion, and it doesn't feel very nice, and we'll do everything to avoid it. We also don't like admitting when we made a mistake. So with property, it's easy to avoid admitting that, because basically until you sell it and realize that loss, it's not really causing you that pain. You can sort of delude yourself that you're doing okay. And I had to have these pretty hard conversations, because this is the first time it actually started biting. It's the first time a dud investment property that they thought was doing all right started actually biting and cutting into their ability to actually live their lives the way they wanted to live. And it impacted on them being able to buy the home that they wanted to live in. And so the decisions that people were making started changing, and their thinking around property started changing. And I don't think that's a bad thing. It's just sad they got sucked in the first place.
Yeah. And like so many things, people will tend to assume one set of things to be true, and it takes an awful lot to shift their thinking, particularly if the media is still playing the same story, right? And I have to say, I remind people that quite a lot of the media are connected with the real estate portals, right? Yes. So when you see something from Domain and Channel 9, you think, well, hang on a moment, there may be a connection. And with the REA and news, there may be a connection, because everybody's sort of winning when there are transactions happening and when property prices are going up. So I always say...
I've got an argument for you there, Martin.
Yeah, no, great.
I mean, because, you had your day in the sun when you were actually on the 60 Minutes program. I think was that in September 2018?
A couple of years ago now.
And you were there with your 20%, your 30%, your 40% price fall scenarios, and yet they led big time with your 40%er. And, Domain, I don't know if they were joined with Fairfax then. I don't know if Channel 9 was...
No, they were on their own then.
Pre-Fairfax days. Maybe that's the reason that they did that.
Well, no, they have had, to be fair, Channel 9 has had me back a couple of times since then.
You're good for advertisers.
Yeah, well, maybe that's the reason. But no, all I'm saying to people is it's important to understand what's going on below the waterline with some of these relationships. And another good one, in fact, Cookie Boy floated this question: what's your thoughts about the hedonic index? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Is there a better way to get a feel on prices?
Now, I did watch your recent interview with is it Edwin Almeida?
Yes.
And, he was tearing it apart. I ignore it. to be honest. I just think it's sort of, I don't know. I'm not an economist. Put my hand up. I'm not a data scientist. So, whatever I say basically means nothing. But when I look at that, I just think you can't have an index that shows a daily property price like in the stock market. It's foolish for starters because it's encouraging people to look at property like stocks, and you can't trade them like stocks. They just don't perform like stocks. And so for me, I'm very uncomfortable with it, and so I ignore it.
I think that's very wise, and I keep saying if you want to know what the value of property is in a local area, go talk to a local agent. He'll be much, much clearer with regard to what's going on than those indices, because the indices really don't tell you. And
the agents can try to talk up areas too, though.
Really?
Yeah. Funny
I find that very surprising.
You just got to go and do your own research. Go and look at houses and apartments. Go and monitor what they sell for. Go to the open houses and see how busy they are. Go and work out, well, why is that one busy and that one not busy? Nothing beats local knowledge and getting on the ground and looking at it yourself. Except if you engage someone like me, of course.
Yeah, but you only deal with up-end market, don't you?
Well, not really, actually. Interestingly enough, there is that perception that a buyer's agent, and yes, I am in an expensive area. I operate obviously in the 10K radius of Sydney, so you've got the eastern suburbs, the inner west, the lower North Shore. That, yes, expensive real estate, but I'm not all for the upper echelon. In fact, to be quite frank, too many alpha people, all have an opinion about property and they'll all argue with me, and I can't be bothered with them. At the end of the day, if they want to make good decisions, I'm here to help them. But if they're that sort of person that has already made a lot of money in other ways, often they just think that they know everything. So they're not our ideal client, to be quite frank. I'd rather help first home buyers.
Yes. No, I think that's probably right. And by the way, I think first time buyers are actually often quite confused by all the things that are going on, and there are sort of various sources of information, but some of them a bit more fragmented and perhaps twisted than they might think.
Yes.
I actually get a lot of people ask me, well, what should I do? And I keep saying, well, I can't give you specific advice, but what I can tell you is if you've saved up your 10%, 15% deposit, you want to be quite sure that you're putting it into somewhere that actually is going to deliver for you and is going to give you the life that you want, or at least, the life that you can afford to want. But also bear in mind that there are always risks, and you could lose that deposit. And if you've spent 15 years trying to save it, it's at risk.
It is at risk. And I think that it's simple as, say, with first home buyers, one of the things that they don't even think about, or often don't think about, is because if they are chasing grants, for instance, they're going to the new subdivision, they don't think that 10 minutes down the road, there's all these other older subdivisions that have got usually bigger houses on bigger blocks of land. And there's like a second wave in these subdivisions where the first lot that are often sold to first home buyers and investors, and the investors start selling out, and then other owner occupiers start moving in, and these homes and these areas become, they get settled in, they get lived in, they get gardens, the trees grow taller, they get a community. And often there's so much better value if you forego those grants and look into those older areas a little bit daggier. They do you a lot better. They get more house for their money. Then they won't lose money the minute they buy it, basically, the minute they settle. So there's so many different options for first home buyers. And also at the end of the day, it's not for everyone. There are other ways to actually invest your money.
And I guess there's a really interesting question there, Veronica, which is, should you consider a property as an investment? In other words, you weigh up property versus shares versus gold versus Bitcoin, right? Or are there other things you need to take account of when you're thinking of property? In other words, have we been lured into this financialization view of property? And is that part of the problem or part of the solution?
Oh, yeah, good one. I encourage all of our owner-occupiers to think like investors, because you're not going to sink that much money into one asset. And obviously, by virtue of that, you can't diversify. Most people don't have enough money to diversify. Certainly not if they're buying their first property. They might be able to buy into shares and or whatnot down the track. But I really do encourage my owner-occupiers to think like investors, because you've got to get this right. And it's great you get some tax benefits, et cetera, for owning your own property, really, in capital, not having to pay capital gains tax. but it's got to go up in value for that to be worth anything, right? So, and on the flip side of things, this idea that everyone can be a property investor is just garbage. I mean, really and truly, and I know it's not a very sort of egalitarian thing to say, but it's a rich person's game. If you don't already earn a good income, there's no point looking to property to replace your income unless you're a tradie. You know, if you're a builder, you might be able to do it, but effectively you're not really replacing your income. You're using your skills to actually potentially help property, build your wealth. But as an income replacement strategy, which is what a lot of these wishful thinking sort of spruikers pump, it's a shocker.
And you don't find out till it's too late, unfortunately, how much of a shock it is. That's the problem, isn't it?
Well, you're sucked in. I sort of use this analogy that it's like walking through a turnstile, right? You've gone through the turnstile. You're in the stadium. You can turn around and you see where you came back from. You didn't really want to go and see AC/DC. You wanted to go and see Adele, and you're in the wrong stadium. You're stuck. Yep. You can't get back up the turnstile.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, here's quite an interesting one. Let's see whether mine. Yes. Hey, there you go. So fair enough about the poorest sub-developments will get smashed. What about the premium suburbs? How will they fare with the loss of middle-income jobs? It's an interesting question.
It is a good question. And look, obviously, I'm not saying that the medium suburbs or even the inner suburbs won't necessarily have some sort of price movement downwards. The thing that you've got to remember, though, in an established suburb, you look up your street and you'll go, your neighbour might have owned their house for 10 years, the one next to them maybe 15, the one next to them maybe 30, the one next to them maybe they bought it 6 months ago. They're a double income, no kids. They're actually retired. And everybody's got a different sort of economic or socioeconomic, maybe not socioeconomic, but certainly a different financial position. And so you're not necessarily going to have this avalanche of people all in exactly the same circumstances, all needing to sell at exactly the same time. And if you have that, then obviously you're going to have a real pressure on prices. But when you've got a situation where people don't have to sell, or they have other alternatives, or they will whatever they're going to do. Okay, when they've got other alternatives and they've got different financial structures, then you're not going to have a uniform impact on a property on a particular area. Obviously, on the flip side of that, you might not have as many buyers. But you might also have opportunistic buyers, and if there's less transactions, there's less buyers, there's less sellers. It sort of holds its own. You get a bit of a Mexican standoff. So that potentially could happen. It's the areas where you got homogenous sort of owners, homogenous type of property. Everyone's in sort of roughly similar situation, and particularly when they're relying on rental incomes. That's when I think you're going to get much more marked effect, where you can actually pinpoint certain areas.
No, that's a very good.
Helps.
No, absolutely. I think that's a really good one. There's another really interesting question here, which I'm just going to try and put up on the screen. There we go. So this is the question: are developers being given loans easily from the banks? My view is developers, no, absolutely not. But are you aware of what's going on the development side of the fence at the moment? And just to explain, I'm just going to leave you to talk because my dog needs to be let out. So keep talking.
Well, that's good timing because I don't have much to say on this topic, but mainly because I'm not privy really to, I don't work with a lot of any developers really. I mean, I've worked with the odd tiny small developer. I also am not that privy to what the banks are doing. But I guess what I would say is that one thing banks are always worried about is risk, and developers I would imagine represent quite a high level of risk for them, particularly at the moment.
Huge risk.
Yeah, so I'm not so sure that if anyone's running around saying, oh, the banks are just giving developers money, I'd be very surprised if that was the case.
So they used to have to get a reasonable proportion sold off the plan before they could get financing, right?
Yeah.
Now banks are saying you need to get an even higher proportion of the plan.
Wow,
but
okay.
About 30% of deals that are signed never go through at the moment. 30%.
30%.
Yep. So in other words, developers don't get enough. And then the second point is the banks are now dropping the amount they will lend relative to the total value that's out there, right? So you put those two things together and it is impossible, nearly impossible. In fact, the only way that some developers are able to do it is to go to the non-bank sector and pay really big bucks for credit to be able. So they've suddenly got this pincer movement where effectively less demand, and frankly, they're having to pay a lot more. Developers are really stuck. And the other thing, of course, is they've tried tricks like, for example, offering, free mortgages for a year and those sorts of things, or guaranteeing rentals for 3 years to try and actually get people to come in, or even let the properties that they've built for the first 3 years to try and actually get a bit over the hump. I mean, the developers, to my mind, are really, against it. And yeah, the banks are not helping. They're actually pulling back more. I think commercial property risk and investment into construction are probably higher risks in the short term than the mortgage sector.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, we had all of that press and so much evidence around settlement risk that was never talked about really before the most recent downturn. And then, of course, you're hearing of such a high proportion of valuations coming in at under the purchase price on settlement. And that's not sort of even taking into account the fact that people's circumstances changed between when they signed a contract and, years later, often when these buildings were completed and they had to settle. So there's so many factors that go into settlement risk. But there was a number of valuers that I heard quoting upwards of 50% of properties were being valued at less than purchase price, and some up to 20% less than purchase price. So the people that are committed to them had to then find those additional funds. And particularly first home buyers, I mean, what a way to put you behind the eight ball. What a horrible situation to be in. But this is the thing too. What a lot of people don't realise is that then if the developer decides to, they can go after you, because you don't just lose your deposit. If they subsequently sell that property at a loss, they can actually go after you for the difference and costs. And I did speak to one developer who said that, that rather than do that, they would actually try to shift the buyer into a smaller, cheaper apartment in the same complex. They prefer to have a settlement, even if it's of a lesser value, than no settlement, and to actually be going to court. So, it's a pretty messy sort of situation for people to be in. So I guess you can understand why banks might be a bit nervous about lending millions and millions of dollars for them.
Yep. No, and we know that building approvals continue to go down rather than up, despite the home builder program that's there. And I say again, home builder is there to help the construction industry, not to help people who want to buy property. It's just they are cannon fodder, I'm afraid. That's how I see it.
You're a good conspiracy theorist, Martin. So what do you think about this conspiracy theory? I sort of cooked up myself, and I don't normally do this, but I noticed I think it was CommBank and NAB came out about a month ago saying, their worst case scenario was, I think it was 30% price falls, and the headlines were like, wiped 30% off the median house price of whatever city you're in, and said your house has just fallen by X hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I thought Westpac and who's the other one? ANZ sitting on the sidelines. It's like, they weren't saying much, but Westpac did come out with their consumer confidence survey at the same time, which showed that confidence was up, isn't that lovely? Yep. And I thought, this is interesting. And I wondered, and this is my conspiracy theory, I wonder, did the big honchos at the four banks, if they sort of meet quietly in a dark corner with social distancing at 1.5 metres away from each other, say, right, NAB and CBA, it's your turn to go out there with the press releases that scare the bejesus out of the market, so the government has to step in with another stimulus for the construction industry. It's your turn. But at the meantime, Westpac, it's your turn. You've got to go out there and make sure that the punters don't get too freaked out, because at the end of the day, someone's got to buy this stuff. So the next thing, the federal government steps in with, what we should do is actually give everybody who wants to build a new house, or they want to do a renovation for up to $150,000, let's give them $25,000. I thought, that was a good little meeting that paid off rather well.
Now, of course, that would never happen, would it? But
I can't imagine it happening.
No. But maybe it's, if everybody's pointing in the same direction, then you end up with that sort of result. But no, they do seem to take turns.
Yes. It's your turn to be a doomsdayer.
But consider this. If CBA was right on its 30% or 32% worst case scenario, right? Well, shouldn't they have revalued their properties?
That's getting...
Because surely, if you've got an economist in the bank saying it's going to be this big, right, and all of your mortgages are assuming that the value is going to be this big, then you've got a problem. So
you wiped everything off. Yeah. But there is a high proportion of equity in this country, right? Mind you, it just comes off the equity. It doesn't come off the mortgage.
See, it's skewed, right? So I mean, it's worth just sort of, high level, a third, right? A third of people rent, a third of people have a property with no mortgage, and a third of people have a property with mortgage. In fact, the two that are growing are the renting and the mortgaged. The people who are mortgage-free are reducing in terms of relative proportion, right? But then the next point is that the distribution of the mortgage means there's about 30% of people with almost no mortgage, right?
Yeah.
A chunk in the middle, and another 30% that has all the debt.
Wow.
So that's the problem. And then if you start then overlaying that with, so where are the negative equity pools and where are the mortgage stress pools? Guess what? They're aligned to the postcodes with the highest level of debt. And frankly, that's the problem. So that's why I keep saying go granular, go granular.
Oh, you have to go granular. We should overlay that with Kent's suburb trends matrix on inventory levels and those longer rental vacancy rates.
We should.
It'd be quite interesting.
I'll send you my set of data because it's down to a postcode level.
Yeah. Well, he does it on SA3s.
Okay. Well, I do
it. Yeah.
I do it at postcode, so we could always lift it up.
Yeah.
I mean, frankly,
what a powerful! What have we done?
A new set of. We could create a new hedonic index.
Oh, wouldn't that be exciting? Dear.
I love it. Okay, now one of the questions that I had in beforehand was this is from a first-time buyer. So the first-time buyers settled in an area that they're interested in. And they said, the question basically was, what are the 2 or 3 things I should do first when I start wanting to sort of burrow in to a particular area and try and get to know it? You sort of touched on it briefly, but I think there's a lot more that you can probably share. And, your book, I think, probably has a lot of tips and ideas in there too.
Well, my book does. And I'm happy to I'll give anyone who wants to buy a copy 30% off and free postage. You just have to get onto getauctionready.com.au and use the code DFA. And then you'll get all those little discounts. Anyway, there's a lot in the book. But to be honest, this is exactly what we do with Home Buyer Academy. And, I've just been doing my little pitch there. Do you mind if I do another one, Martin? We do a Facebook Live every Wednesday night at 7:30. And so it's a live Q&A for first home buyers on Facebook at the Home Buyer Academy Facebook page. And we ran a workshop a couple of weeks ago for a group of people that have been joining us. And it's a workshop to teach them how to work out where to buy their first property. And so it's a very structured approach that we have. And so I really, there's a lot of that is actually around really working out what you want and then actually researching recent sales, because what people don't do, they don't look at recent sales when they research a market. They look at what's on the market at the moment. And that's actually not very helpful because none of that's actually sold. So I recommend that you do that. You got to get in there and get to understand values, not just as they happen, but what has sold recently. So what you get for your money, it's that reality check. But you also have to, if you're going to live there, you have to go and make sure that it's PLUs, the people like us, it's a community that you can actually feel comfortable in, and not just for the short term, but for the longer term. And so this is what a lot of first home buyers also need to remember is that what about 5 years time, 10 years time? What am I going to want to do? Do I want to get married? Do I want to have kids? Do I want to work overseas? Would that be lovely? What do I want to do? What do I want my life to look like? And of course it could change. But the thing is that quite often people buy the wrong property because it won't last them that period of time. And, if they have to change it, or they hadn't considered whether it will be an investment property, for instance, after a period of time, and haven't set up their mortgage correctly. So by not actually thinking of the future, they can shoot themselves in the foot. And the other thing is literally just get out there and inspect property, and just don't go out there with your wallet in your pocket. Like, don't get financed straight up. Don't be ready to buy when you're looking for a bit while you're researching. And then when you do actually go with intent, make sure you get financed for the most amount of money you could possibly borrow. And I'm not saying that you should spend all of that money. I'm just saying that what will happen is save you time if you find out that you actually could buy a better asset for a little bit more money because you're trying to stay under a level in order to get a grant usually. But if you can avoid that, sometimes there's better value a little bit over a price, just that next hump, that next price bracket. So they're just a couple of tips.
Yeah, and I think there's one that I'd add, and that is you always have to make compromises, right?
Yes.
You can never get absolutely everything. Location, it's impossible, right?
The workshop that we do actually takes you through. So we call it the 3 Ps. There's 3 Ps in every property search, and one of them is going to flex more than the other 2. Okay, so there's the property, there's the price or your budget, and then there's the position or the location. And so this workshop, we actually take first home buyers working through each of those 3 Ps, so you can work out which is the one that you will need to compromise on. And it's a really fascinating exercise, actually, but it's really necessary because, yes, you're right, no property is perfect. And if I gave you more money, then your expectations would go up and you still wouldn't be getting the perfect property.
Yeah, and that's the point. Even at the top end of the market, you're still making compromises.
Exactly right.
There's going to be a post in the way, or there's going to be something else that's not quite right about it, or the view isn't right. So that's just the nature of the
human
beast.
nature.
Yes. No, it is. It is absolutely. I just want to make a quick call out here to Heisey Says, who's here tonight. Hi, Heisey. Nice to see you on. He's another channel that's on quite a lot, talking some interesting stuff that is actually not completely disconnected with some of the stuff that we talk about, and so that's good. Now, there was another question which came in beforehand, and this is actually the other end of the spectrum. So there's somebody who's approaching retirement in the next couple of years. They've got a lot of equity in their property, but they're seeing property prices beginning to fall. Mm-hmm. They're going to have to do something in the next 2 to 3 years. Tricky.
Very tricky.
What are the things that you think they should be thinking about at this time? Do you jump quick? Do you wait?
It's hard. That is very hard. A lot of it depends on where they are, because different areas will.
Middle suburbia, so not within your 10K ring, but not right out on the edge.
The next side of that is where they would want to go next.
Yeah.
Because I really do believe that if you don't know what your next step is, you're better off to stay put. And a lot of people sort of jump quickly and then they still don't know, you know what I mean? And they sort of have to work that out. So I think that's a really important thing to do, to really actually be very, very clear on your next step. A lot of people try to ride the market. They try to pick the peak. They try to pick the bottom. Most people get it wrong, because at the end of the day, you only know when it's in the rear vision mirror anyway. But even the experts can't get it right. So, of the recent downturn, when it stopped, when it ended, we put out a full forecaster report on the podcast every year on April Fool's Day, and nobody gets it right. I mean, Stuart Weems actually picked the bottom of the market last year, but for the wrong reasons. He just happened to luck it, and he admits that too. So trying to ride the market, trying to say, well, I've got to get out now because things are going to fall, is problematic, because you might be wrong. And if you're not an expert, there's a high chance you could be wrong. And if you are ready to make your next move, if you're going to downsize and you think, well, I could do it now, then might be a good time to do it now, and maybe bring it forward. But you've got to be clear on what your next step is.
And I think that really, to me, highlights the dilemmas that people are facing, right? And I see this in my surveys all the time. There are no simple answers at the moment, right?
No, there never are though.
Well,
it's just,
that's probably true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Although if you were actually in a in the last few years where prices have tended to go that way relatively consistently over the medium term, it's a little easier.
It might be easier, might feel easier, but the reality is upgraders were stupid to be upgrading in those conditions.
Right.
They
Yeah.
all feel good about it. They feel great because of this great price they got for their place. They were completely conveniently forgetting the big price they had to pay on the way up, And conversely, in 2018, that was the ideal time to upgrade in Sydney. And yet, I had some clients holding their hands through the process, dragging them along, going, you will be happy once this is done because you took a little bit of a haircut on your sale price, but oh my God, you're taking a bigger haircut on what you're buying. I mean, they're taking a bigger haircut than you're getting. So your transaction cost to upgrade now is going to be smaller and a hell of a lot more achievable than if you wait or if you did it a year earlier. So, but they still fixate on the sale price of their home. And these are smart people. This is not just relegated to people who aren't too clever. These are successful people in their own rights. And it's back to the emotion around property.
Yeah. And sometimes making those hard decisions rationally is difficult, right? Because you're emotionally tied up in it as well, and nobody wants to lose money. See the dollars go down. I mean, I've lived through 4 property crashes around the world. The worst, I lost about 15 to 20% of the value of my property in about 12 months. I know that. But what can you do? It's just you've got to carry on.
Look, I've got my own story on that. I mean, I'm an expert, right? I should better pick the property market, right? There have been times I can dine out on one property I bought. I bought an investment property in October 2012. I can dine out on that one, right, in Sydney, a house. I also sold a house. I sold my own home in September 2015. That was the peak of the market that year. Could dine out on that one. But, in September 2018, I sold another house in order to pay for a renovation of the house that I'm in now. And you know what? I knew that the timing was crap. I absolutely knew it was awful. I really just wanted to get on with the renovation, and I didn't want to borrow the money from the bank. So I just made a call to do it. In fact, I couldn't borrow the money from the bank because the banks had tightened up everything. So I was sort of had to do it if I wanted to get on with my life. And I made that decision, and I knew that I was making it eyes wide open. Still hurt, wasn't easy. You know what? A year later, they sold, and they made another $200,000.
Yeah.
So, and I'm an expert.
Object lesson there, right?
Yeah, well, I console myself by saying I am now in my renovated home, and I would still be waiting for it to be built if I was, if I hadn't done it. So,
Well, I always make the point, if you're in the market, you've already got a property, right, and you're looking to move, wherever you buy, right, the markets are going up or going down. So you only need one and one, and therefore it's not too much of a problem. Maybe
it's better than if you're not in it.
Yeah, but that's the point. If you are not in the market, and you're trying
you could be 2 different markets, though, Martin.
That's true. Absolutely. Yeah, no, and that's right. And I've seen a few examples where people have jumped from one to the other. I mean, Hobart's a really interesting market, right? So there's been a massive run up then over the last couple of years, but the last quarter, I think the value of rents dropped by 9% in 3 months. In 3 months. So Hobart, I think, is in for a big shake-up.
Well, funnily enough, because hasn't Hobart got a massive rental shortage?
Yes,
where has everyone gone?
Yeah, good question. Well, because a lot of it, of course, was Airbnb and tourism, right? Because a greater proportion of Tasmania is actually tourism related. So that's a really big deal. And then I've also noted there's some really interesting stuff going on in Brisbane. Again, in the high-rise sector, massive amounts of vacancy in the high-rise sector in close to the CBD. So you think there are going to be some really significant issues playing out there.
Well, that's been a problem for a decade.
I know. And some of the prices in and around Brisbane were higher a decade ago than now. So the idea of prices going up all the time, well, forget it. It's nothing like reality.
there's no sign of it changing. So, they could have a situation unheard of where 20 years' time, people are getting less money than what they paid for it. I mean, that's just nuts.
Yep. Yeah. And remember, that's, not taking out of inflation, right? If you take inflation into account as well over the decade, right?
Yep, holding costs, interest,
exactly,
et cetera. And if they didn't, well, they wouldn't have done any renovating because they're brand new. But that's all right. They got negative gearing.
So now, Cookie Boys asked this question. It's a pretty straightforward one. I won't try and put it up on the screen because my thing's frozen again. Will high unemployment crash the market? So what's your perspective with regard to unemployment and how that's going to play out?
Okay, well, once again, I'm not an expert in this area, but I think we have to sort of remember, okay, that if we've got 10% unemployment, 90% of people are employed. And so 90% of people are still earning incomes. If we get 20%, 80%, and this is the thing that we sort of forget. We think nobody's going to have a job. So we also forget everyone has to live in a house or an apartment, in a dwelling, let's say. Everybody has to live in a dwelling. We might have oversupply of dwellings, okay? And obviously that's a different issue. But at the end of the day, we're not all going to suddenly go home to mum and dad. So I think the reality is, yes, we are going to there's some headwinds, right? Obviously. And some people are going to suffer a hell of a lot more than others. And not just because they lose their jobs or don't lose their jobs, but because of the type of property that they own. But the fact is, we all need to live in a dwelling and we're not all going to lose our jobs. So I just think we sort of have to remember that.
And of course, it's not going to be uniform across the country. It's not going to be uniform across industries. So again, I think we have to go patchwork, right? I think it's really important that we don't just lump everything in together and say, what's it? I think that the Treasurer came out with 13% as a real unemployment figure. We get real figures on Thursday, but it's not uniform.
I think also, and look, it's absolutely unfortunate for millennials, but they have unfairly borne the brunt of the job losses as well. And so obviously there's a bit of a knock-on effect in terms of rentals, and rents, and tenancies, et cetera. But given that it's sort of skewed in that direction, a lot of those wouldn't necessarily be in the home owning bracket anyway. So I think that's sort of something else that needs to be considered. Yeah,
I think that's right. I mean, again, complexity, have to go down and down and down. That's why I do everything at postcode levels, because, when you try and aggregate up, you lose the gradation. Here's an interesting one. I got my thing back. Would Veronica change her language with a prospective client, not a first home buyer, to speculation rather than investment? P.S. Lovely name, chose for my daughter.
Well, you know what? It's years before I met another Veronica, and all of a sudden there's lots of them, and they're all young. Isn't that lovely? Yeah, absolutely. I think that most investors are speculating. I use the word investors. It's like you can't invest when such a high proportion are actually losing money. So, and I'm talking about capital gain. I'm not going to focus on yield. I don't focus on yield. So yes, I think in any investing, as Martin said earlier, there's an element of risk, and I think that that's something that needs to be heavily considered when it comes to property, because of the sheer amount of money and the fact that you're putting all your eggs in one basket and you're borrowing so much. So I'm very careful around the wording that I use. I do actually talk to some people about to make decisions on property, and I do say that they are gambling. So, and I'm not a gambler. So in fact, even currently, I've been thinking about this a lot actually the last week, and just investing in particular in property at the minute. And I'm just thinking that really it's got to be almost like an inflation hedge in a way. There's no real reason that you would buy an investment property at the minute unless you had quite a lot of surplus cash.
Yeah. Why would you, when values will go down or level in real terms?
And also your cash flow position is going to be, really struggling. So you have to be, and so therefore, yes, you'd be speculating. But I think there are some types of property, and I reckon only 5%. I'm not talking a lot here, maybe not even that much, maybe 1%, that is a fair bet that is worth speculating on and is worth sort of copying that cash flow problem in for the foreseeable future.
Thanks. No, good point there. Now, here's one from Justin. If you're in a high-rise apartment in Docklands, Victoria, you can hear all your neighbours. They are built so cheap and not a good investment. So what about this issue of poor quality construction and all of the issues related to that? How do you see that?
It's funny. I have a vision. I have a vision that nobody actually needs to lose money in property. Imagine that. And the only way that can come about, and we can still have a construction industry and still build new stuff, is if purchasers demand higher quality. And unfortunately, it's this sort of situation where people, not knowing any better, investors predominantly, buying this crap that has been built to a price and being sold this dream about properties always going up and all the rest of it. So until I think the buy, and I've had this argument where people have said to me, well, they must want it because if there was no market for it, it wouldn't be built and all this sort of stuff. Now, it's all sort of been created, but the reality is people are starting to realise what crap it is. So hopefully the market starts demanding, you know what, no, we don't want that crap anymore. And then developers will be forced to actually build better designed developments and also better executed. But it's a vision.
Well, of course, you say they're built to a price, low as possible, particularly when the finance is difficult to come. And frankly, if they're selling to offshore investors and people who may not even look at the property, right? Yeah. They can perhaps get away with it. But the truth is that the quality of recent construction is definitely an issue. And I saw in the chat earlier on, somebody asked, do you expect to see more Opal Tower type problems? My answer is almost certainly, because the processes have been in place for 20 years or so. We're going to see more difficult construction issues.
Well, we interviewed Dr. Nicole Johnson. She's from Deakin University. She's an author of a report on building defects, and it's really a preliminary report. And she interviewed, and I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but something like she interviewed a whole bunch of people. She also looked at sort of building consultants' records in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, and sort of put together a methodology to try and work out, what was really the story with building defects. And she says, in the report, this is just a conversation starter effectively. But New South Wales was the worst by far, and I wish I could remember the figures off the top of my head, but it was something like, and I could be wrong, 93% of apartments included in the survey, and there was something like 1,000 or 1,300 apartments in the survey, had defects. And I guess they could be minor, they could be major, but that's a ridiculous percentage. I think Queensland was something like 72%, and I think Victoria might have been 74%. So, you could say that really nearly 3/4, and in New South Wales, nearly 100% of brand new apartments, these are all buildings that had been assessed within their warranty period, if they had a warranty, or within the statutory period, had defects. And that's just not acceptable. And you've also got, and they're pointing, and this is sort of, I guess, was brought to a head through Opal Towers, Mascot Towers, and various other buildings that we don't know the names of, but this has been happening where people can't live in them. Terrible situations. And then you've even got the combustible cladding issue. You've got so little scrutiny on this industry. And also it's very difficult to point the finger in any one particular direction. I know that the finger is being pointed in the direction of private certifiers, and that's unfair too, because it's not just them. It's endemic in the whole system. So until that's sorted out, until the governments have the will to sort this stuff out, it ain't going to get sorted out.
The question is, do they have the will? Here's another one. Jared said, I worked as an architectural carpenter. I can assure you that all new construction is made out of balsa wood and tissue paper.
Oh, wow.
Well, that's certainly quite a few, and I've seen a few other comments there as well that the quality of construction. I've actually looked at a few places relatively recently, and it's still happening. So whatever needs to be done in terms of accountability, ownership, and frankly, end-to-end tightening of processes, certainly in New South Wales, has not yet been done. So we're going to see more of it.
I think you have to stick to, if you are going to go down that path, which obviously I encourage you not to do, but you really have to look at the really big developers. I'm not going to name them, but the well-known, the ones with big brands, the ones with really good processes for handling defects, with amazing track records, not ones that set up a little company that then phoenixes when the building's finished. You really want to get those big brand name developers, and you don't want to go anywhere else, because I really think that there's just a lot of risk. There's so much risk, it's ridiculous. But at least the big brand developers have got a brand that they need to protect.
Yeah, it's the fly-by-nights that come and then disappear, and you look around and think, well, hang on, there's a building firm there, and now it's gone.
Yeah, usually named the name of the street, so it's like, 320 King Street, Proprietary Limited.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Aaron asked this a little while ago. What do you think the impact of the 20K superannuation withdrawals will have on the market? Will this be leveraged up or just gobbled up?
I don't think it's enough to make any material difference, quite frankly. I don't know. Probably not.
So I can tell you that my surveys, there are people who definitely have taken the 20K, the 10K and 10K, and then added in the 55K from Western Australia, if they're in WA, and have created this edifice to be able to go buy a property. So there are people doing that.
No way.
No, truly.
Dear God.
Truly. And, you sit there and think, well, hang on a moment. So you've got 20K from the government, or your own money back from superannuation, right?
Yeah, but this is a problem, though. I think a lot of people don't see it as their money.
No.
So they see it as money from the government, which is why they're so cavalier with it.
Yeah.
I remember sitting in an Uber one day and talking to this fellow telling me, I've bought these 2 properties in my self-managed super fund, and it's not my money anyway. He actually said that. I was like, well, I'm glad you feel that way, because you probably just did it all.
Yeah, and the point is that money has to come from somewhere, right? From taxpayers or somebody else. So it's moving the money around the system. So for every winner there's a loser, every loser there's a winner. Unfortunately. Okay, here's another one. This is from Mickey. I sell residential solar. Does this add to property value? And anything else to mention with regard to solar? Is it good or not good?
God, I wish it did. I really wish it did. And I really wish also that all these house and land packages were forced to put solar on their north-facing, panels, their north-facing roof faces. Not yet, not really. Maybe on the odd occasion. It's not yet in demand. And basically, people aren't prepared to pay for it. We're still very much the payoff period is, I think, too long for people to seriously see it as a real value add. And it might be perceived by some buyers to be a value add, but I wouldn't say materially I've seen any evidence of it thus far.
Yeah. And I think I'd say the same from my surveys. It's interesting that people, when I survey them about their plans for renovations or improvements, solar was higher. It's come down the list a long way. And that's partly perhaps because the cost is lower, but also because the returns perhaps don't seem to stack up.
They do something where you could sell it back to the grid and then they stop that or something. I mean,
that's correct.
I think if you could power your neighbour's house and they've got only south-facing roof and you've got a north-facing roof, you could do all that sort of stuff. There'd be more of an incentive for people to do it.
Yeah, well, I looked at batteries here and it was, because that was the only reason to do it. And
no storage, yeah.
Doesn't make any sense. Okay, here's another one. With current interest rates being an all-time low, do you think there is room to go lower, or would you lock in a fixed rate now? Okay.
Well, I'm not an interest rate expert. I can only go by the Reserve Bank saying they're not going to drop any further. So I believe everything I read. Who knows? Is all I can say. Who would have thought we'd have a pandemic shutting the world down? And, you've got some countries with negative interest rates, they get paid money to take a mortgage. Really? How does that even work? I can't wrap my head around it. So I'm certainly not the person to answer that question. In terms of whether you should fix rates, you should definitely get advice from a really good mortgage broker. And me personally, I like to fix a little bit anyway. I like to hedge my bet. So that's just my personal position on that. So you've got to look at the deals you get at the banks at the moment. There's some good deals out there.
There are some really good deals, both on the fixed and the variable side. The thing about fixed is it's an insurance if rates were to go up, right? But you lose if rates go further down. The question is it likely that from this point they'll go further down? Probably not very much. The banks will shave a little bit for some people with low loan-to-value ratios.
Yeah.
So it's worth shopping around. And I did a thing with CanStar the other week where we looked at the different opportunities that there were, and there are big variations. The major banks often more expensive compared with some of the other players. So shop around. My own sense is that where we are, the fix probably is almost, running out of smoke in terms of what may happen.
Yeah, and what's sort of interesting, when I first got my first mortgage all those years ago, when you fixed, the fixed rate was higher than the variable rate.
Yeah. That's right.
Because we all came off the memory of 17 and 18% interest rates. So, for me, I think fixed is lower than variable. Well, that's why I'm prepared to take the punt on part of the mortgage. But it's something that everybody has to look into, and they definitely should shop around.
Yeah, shop around and check every 3 to 6 months because deals change, right? And it amazes me in my surveys again how many people are on the rate that they got 2 to 3 years ago, and they've never even thought to check it, right? And they're paying 1 to 1.5% above what they could be paying.
Because the banks very rarely volunteer that stuff.
Oh no, they don't. No, exactly right. It would be amazing if the bank rang up and said, "Do you realise that you actually could get a cheaper rate if you did this?" No.
My broker rang me once and said that, which was nice. But, it's funny, actually. I read somewhere, oh, God, I don't know where it was. I think it was a mortgage broker that said this. He said you could pay your loan off 5 years faster if you just refinance every single year. And I thought, well, that's something that should be worth looking into. I'm not sure if you can or can't, but I thought it's an interesting one. Let's refinance every year and you could pay it off 5 years faster. That's an incentive. Yeah.
Well, particularly with interest rates coming down, there are people stranded on this, and I call them, they're people basically the apathy trap, right? It's just too hard. No, it's not. It isn't really hard. It's just you have to get round to doing it. So, I always say to people, stick a diary note in twice a year, check your mortgage rate.
Yeah, personal housekeeping.
Pretty important. Now, here's one that you may choose not to answer, and if you choose not to answer, then that's fine. But I've had a couple of people saying, as a woman in the real estate sector, right, do you think that's an advantage or a disadvantage? And bearing in mind that a lot of senior people in the real estate are blokes, what's the gender question in the sector?
It's funny, actually. I went to a women's real estate function a couple of years ago. You got to remember, okay, I joined real estate in 2000. I worked for a female-owned and run agency. I had, in my time there, a number of assistants. 2 of those were actually male. At each time, there was a maximum of 2 men working in that office with over 20, 30 staff. So I came into real estate thinking that it was a completely female-dominated industry. And, of course, in the inner west where I was working, there are a lot of female agents and a lot of principals and businesses were agents. So I went to this function a few years back, and I was chatting to this young woman. She's a millennial and she's really enthusiastic about her career in real estate. She said, oh, God, it's just so male-dominated. I'm like, what are you talking about? I had absolutely no idea, none, about how male-dominated certain sectors of the market are. And I guess when we started the podcast and we started interviewing people, I suddenly started realising all the experts, I could get like 1 in 4 was a woman. And there are a lot of women in property, and we've interviewed a lot of women in property, but it's really interesting that even I, just because it's in my own little bubble, I had no idea. So for me, I just I just get on with it, don't even think about it. But it is a real thing for a lot of other people working in property. I think too, because I guess because I'm mouthy, that some bloke says some stupid thing to me or tries to bully me, then I'll push back. Whereas a lot of women don't, and a lot of men don't too, for that matter. So there is a lot of bullying that does go on and sort of in property. There's no doubt about it, and a lot of sort of bravado, and that does make it hard for property buyers. And in fact, I spoke to a woman only this week who was saying that she felt she wasn't taken seriously. So I think that there is an issue, obviously, for women out there. We're both working in the industry and also buying property. But for me, a mouthy person who got into the industry working with women for women, I barely noticed it.
How interesting. Yeah, very thank you for that. Now, here's one. 30-year fixed rate mortgage is bread and butter in the US. Should we do the same in Australia? Would it make sense after prices are adjusted to mean? So we don't have long-term fixed rates, right? Unlike the US. Would that make a difference, do you think?
I couldn't comment on that, Martin. I think that's your jurisdiction.
Yeah, it'll never happen. The reason it's like it is in the US is because that's been a long-term structure that they've had. Most people here are on variable rates, and the banks are actually used to managing that. They won't go much beyond 5 years fixed, and I don't think that's going to change, partly because of the unpredictability of funding in a smaller market that we are, and the fact we get a lot of our funding from overseas, unlike the US where they do a lot of it locally. So no, I think it's unlikely that will ever happen. And by the way, you still might see 50-year mortgages like in Japan.
Wow.
That's actually what they've done. So they've actually got intergenerational mortgages there to try and deal with some of these unaffordability issues. So
wow.
Can you imagine
there
that?
There you go.
So you parcel up your mortgage and into your will and give it to your kids to sort out.
There you go, kids.
Now here's another one. This is from Ron. Even if Sydney and Melbourne real estate fell by 50%, it would still be overvalued compared to an average yearly wage. Yeah, there's some interesting questions about what is an average, right? Because obviously averages vary. But yeah, sure. Property prices in Sydney relative to incomes way over Melbourne too. We've got a long way to come back. I argue there's a risk of a 40% correction. Well, that's where that comes from.
Yeah.
One of the reasons where it comes from.
But when you say wages, are you saying Sydney wages or Australian wages?
I think you're sort of suggesting that Sydney and Melbourne wages, yeah.
Higher.
They are higher, but
which
they've
is
still
one
got
of the reasons
massive
that prices are higher.
6, 7, 8 times income.
Yeah.
Did you see one of the large banks dropped it from 9 times, I think it's to 8 times? I thought, that would make a huge difference, right?
Yeah. Well, we'll be just going down the 50-year mortgage and passing on the debt to our kids.
Yeah, well, it could be an intergenerational debt.
Yes. It's what life insurance is for, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, what happens to the market when the boomers die off? And will imported Hong Kongers save the banksters?
Oh, definitely. I think that the latter question, absolutely. How many are we importing? I forgot to pay attention.
Well, at the moment, there are 10,000 here who now have residential status,
yeah,
potentially. So it's not like it's a large number.
I got carried away by the second half of that question. What was the first half?
So this is the question: what happens when the baby boomers die off? So in other words, the older generations, right? We've had this bulge working all the way through the market for years and years and years, and they're now all moving into retirement. But in 10 years or 20 years, some of them will actually start,
falling off the twig.
Well, could you oversupply?
They're gonna leave their fortune, all the fortune that the millennials are so resentful that they have. They're going to leave all that to the millennial kids, right? I can only
either
guess.
That or they've spent it all driving around the place and having a great time
in their Winnebago. Oh God, it's funny. I don't know. Look, there's so much of this. Not all baby boomers have got lots of money, and a lot of them live in pretty old houses. My parents, they're in the same house they took me to when I was 6 months old, and we don't have to talk about how long they've had that house for. And, until they finally decide they're going to move into a nursing home. But that house is not worth a lot of money. And, some years back, in fact, I went through the exercise with them 8 years back. I went through the exercise of them downsizing into an apartment, and it was actually very affordable for them then, and they would have actually had cash left over. But now downsizing into an apartment in the same suburb that they live in, they can't afford to do it. So a lot of these baby boomers are stuck in their houses because they're daggy, they're old. Nobody wants to necessarily buy them.
That's the property. That's the property, right?
Yeah, the they're running out and buying all that new house and land packages. They don't want I'm not telling you how old the house is. And they're in this sort of no man's land stock. A lot of these people. So not all baby boomers have loads of money, but anyway. So I'll get a pittance inheritance when they do finally fall off the tree.
Yes. And what is interesting is that, as we highlighted earlier on, I think some of those, boomers are really quite confused about what to do, and it's not straightforward, because if you think about going into slightly more sheltered accommodation, you get caught in huge fees and all sorts of difficult issues like that. If you try and downsize into a smaller place or an apartment, quite often you can't find it in the same location. And there's, people have been suggesting the government should actually bring incentive schemes to help people come out of bigger properties into smaller properties, but yet more money going to the property sector. Well,
yeah, but that's a bit naive too, because it's assuming that everybody wants those sort of properties, and this is what I'm talking about. A lot of these sort of older suburban areas, I think there's some good opportunities for first home buyers are a bit handy to get in there, but you get a lot bigger blocks of land, they're established, et cetera, more value, and you're probably cheaper than buying a brand new house and land package somewhere. But the thing is that it is difficult for them, and getting into assisted care and nursing homes. Oh my God, have you ever been through that exercise? Have you actually looked at those? They're draconian, those contracts. There's nothing left quite often at the end of them. They're really, really bad. And so and if there's two people in a home and they can't afford to both get in to sell that house and actually both get into assisted care, so there's a problem there as well.
Yes. Here's one from Steve over in Ireland, saying, sitting here in Ireland 12 years post GFC and a few weeks post lockdown, and I can't believe the spending I'm seeing. Economics is more about psychology than interest rates, I'm afraid.
Yes.
Spot on.
Yeah, got it.
Is what we said earlier on about lemmings and all those sorts of things. I mean, the fact is, of course, that the consumption is half the economy, right? So that's the way the economy has been structured and engineered over the last generation or so. A lot of that is based off equity out of wealth effect of house prices.
Yeah, the wealth effect is fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
Really. But also you look at what the spending was. I mean, who's that mob that, is it Ilian that does the spending data? Have you been watching that? So through the lockdown here, in terms of, where the growth areas were in terms of consumer spending, and, obviously Bunnings, takeaway food, but definitely not luggage. What was it? But the home improvement sector just went crazy, and also fitness. All these exercise bikes and treadmills.
Yeah, and home computers and.
Selling out of offices.
Exactly.
Desks and chairs, and but you think, really, you have to go and get a treadmill? Talk about the psychology. It's just nuts. You're not going to be locked up forever.
Yeah. And I do keep coming back to the point that you can apply rationality to some things, but you can't get away from the psychology of individuals, but also the political psychology. And last week ScoMo, when he was talking about the lending figures, which were down significantly, went out of his way to say we don't have a speculative bubble. It's nothing to do with investors, right? Everything's perfectly fine in the property market in Australia. So there's a certain level of what shall I say, opinions that may not be completely grounded in fact in a number of areas.
Just it's all about keep calm and carry on.
Exactly. Well, talking about keep calm and carry on, we're nearly at 9:28, so I guess we're there. I guess a couple of sort of closing questions. So what is the most critical thing that you're watching at the moment with regard to the next few months in the development of the property market?
I am watching what's happening in apartments in Sydney. We've got apartments. So I guess what really irritates me with the whole apartment thing is the very fact that there is no really good data that separates established versus new versus nearly new. And so I am really looking at what's happening in terms of vacancies and also how permanent that situation is. Whether there'll be return of tenancies, and also what's happening with that is that as leases as leases expire, what sort of churn we're going to see, and fundamentally where rents are going to sort of settle. So that's something that I'm looking at the moment.
Very interesting. And, nobody knows about that because there are so many variables that are actually driving that outcome. Right?
Exactly.
And that's what I keep saying to people is you got to understand how complicated this thing is. This is a complex dynamic system with multiple variables all interacting on each other.
Yep.
Political pressures, financial pressures, international pressures. Put all that in the pressure cooker. That's why I run scenarios, because I think it's the only way to go with trying to sort of guide people to what's going on. So very good. Somebody else just asked, is there a right amount to spend on property? I think that's probably it depends answer, isn't it?
It always depends. It depends whether it's your own home, it depends whether it's an investment, it depends where you're buying. There's this I like to look at a bell curve. So in every suburb there's a bell curve, and that means in that bell curve you're going to look at the most popular price brackets, and that means where the most amount of buyers are spending money. So you buy a property that sits within that bell curve for any given suburb, and it has all the characteristics that lots of buyers in that area like, then you are pretty much picking an asset that's probably going to do really well. So there you go. That's what I'd look for. And it's hard to find the bell curve. I'd actually point you to Kent's website that I mentioned before, Suburb Trends. He does have this thing called a price segmentation graph, which I particularly like, and that is the bell curve. It's the graph, and you can go back, I think, 5 years for each suburb. You look at houses and look at units. You got to separate them out, and so for every suburb you can check, and so you can actually see where, if you're thinking about spending $800,000 on a house, for argument's sake, and in that area, that's the most popular price segment. It can also help you sort of work out whether you're overcapitalizing if you're buying something to renovate as well. So there's just some handy little tips with that. It's one of my favorite graphs.
Wonderful. Well, we've reached the end of the show. I want to thank you, Veronica, for spending an hour and a half plus with us. It's been an education. I think we've covered a lot of ground. We haven't answered all the questions, but you never do on these sorts of things. If people want to find more about you, what's the best place to go?
Well, you should just go to the Elephant in the Room Property Podcast. It's probably the easiest way to get access to everything that I do. I've obviously in my main business is Good Deeds Property Buyers in Sydney. That's sort of like my baseline business, if you like. But if you're a first home buyer, I can encourage you to go to homebuyeracademy.com.au or come onto Facebook Live Wednesdays at 7:30 p.m. I just really, really, really have a passion for helping first home buyers not put a step wrong. And, I just want to get more to understand. There's so much conflicted advice out there, and we're really seeking to redress that.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much for that, Veronica. I'm just going to make my closing remarks. So just hang on there and while I do that. So I want to say thank you very much for sparing so much of your time with my audience tonight. People are very appreciative on the chat. Just to say that next week at the same time, I'll be running a Q&A on the household confidence and property scenarios, which I'll be updating. And that will be bang up to date with all the latest information, and we'll be taking into account, for example, the impact of the COVID in Melbourne. So that'll be quite an interesting show. The following week, Edwin's coming back on, and a couple of weeks later we've got a discussion with Robbie Barwick and somebody else on China, which should be an interesting conversation. So that's just up ahead. So I want to thank you once again, Veronica. It's been great. Thank you for your time. We'll put the links to your various sites and things below. Recommend you go there. And I think the Elephant in the Room podcast in particular is brilliant, and I enjoy listening to them. In fact, I participated quite recently, so that was quite fun too. So with that, I want to wish everybody a happy evening. Stay safe, keep a distance, and we will be back next week. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.
Cool.